Welcome back. In session 7, we're going to address what we call the declaration lead. Now, here we are in this is the most indirect range one of the more indirect promos in the very unaware range of that awareness spectrum. So what is this declaration lead? What does that mean? A declaration lead is something that comes out and it tries to make a big, bold statement so that you jar this person out of wherever it is that they are. It's like a thing that's just supposed to interrupt the position that they're in. Why would you want to do that? At this range, when somebody is not very aware of, say, very distant from being aware of the product that you're offering, so you couldn't just come out and start talking about the product. They're often not aware of the solutions that are out there. They are not aware maybe even of the problems that they're addressing. They just have sort of a vague sense that there's something going on. Here, it's very difficult to know how to start talking to somebody, so you need to just get something that's going to get them to pay attention. So the declaration lead comes out and makes that bold assertion of some kind, and we'll see some samples of what that means. It's meant to startle people and intrigue them. Now, you can't just startle and intrigue them. There's a little bit more to it than that, and we'll explore that now. But the statement is definitely targeting those emotions that that person might have. That's the one connection that you have if you can address the right emotion that they have. And it's going to have to connect to that emotion in a way that is somehow important to them. That often means that you're going to imply that something they're worried about is actually going to be the thing that comes along if they don't prepare. Or it may be something that's a bold claim, a bold statement that gives them a feeling that something good could happen, that there's an implied promise that's based in that. So often when you make this bold statement, you're also going to see that it's often followed up by an implied promise. So here we are. If you were going to try to position that on this awareness scale, it would be more down at that range, so down at this problem where people are less aware. Here isn't a good example of one. This is what I said before, how it interrupts that position from everyone. We often use the term a pattern interrupt. So a person goes about their daily life, they have their daily routines, they hear these same messages over and over again, and you're trying to come out there and say something that's stronger and different and unique from what they're hearing right away. That is the pattern interrupt. You're interrupting the patterns of their life. And it gets the reader to pay attention. What on earth is this new thing that I see coming along here? This was a famous old Bookalog, which is a book-like package, very small, which came out in about 1993, 1994. It was for a financial product when people were very concerned about the rising debt crisis. Now, of course, we continue to have a debt crisis then, but that was when we started to be very concerned about how the U.S. debt was mounting quickly. The plague of the Black Debt, how to survive the coming depression. At the time, was anybody saying that we had a coming depression? No, they weren't addressing that, but there were people who had those fears, and here was somebody coming out and being bold and saying that. Here's another one. This was for a health promotion that mailed this, I believe was back in the 80s. So, read this or die. Well, that is a very big, bold claim, big, bold statement. It's not necessarily promising you anything right away or anything like that, but it's very hard to resist the idea that if you don't read this, there's going to be some imminent threat to your health that you need to pay attention to. So, that's startling, that idea about it being startling. That's the very first thing you need to know about how these declaration leads work. It has to be something that nobody else is saying. Otherwise, it's not startling. You can't startle somebody with repetition of what everybody else, an echo message. You have to be the first to come out and say it. It's also why that is often positioned as breaking news. So it might remind you, a declaration lead might remind you of the kinds of things that you'd see like on a supermarket newspaper, like a National Enquirer thing. Well, they're usually more serious and more important than that, but positioned as breaking news. So here's one that goes out for the people who get the physician's desk reference. That's the big thing that the doctors have on their desk that tells them about which drugs are out, which they interact with, and it's very important that that is up to date. If the drug interactions are not up to date, you risk prescribing to somebody where you could cause a serious health problem. So, warning, your 1995 PDR is obsolete. So that's a bigger and more emotional punch than saying, hey, the new PDR, the new physician's desk references are out. That's just a statement. But when you do this, there's a warning. It's very serious. You see this big, bold claim that's coming out. You might use it as not necessarily breaking news, something that's happening now, but it could be a prediction. So you could be looking at what is something that's coming down the pike. That's a big deal. So why most 20th century diseases will soon become extinct. That seems like a big news story if that's really what's going to happen, and that comes down the pike. You really want to know what that is. How could that be that all these diseases would become extinct? The boldness makes you want to hear what that's all about. And this goes on through into how one maverick doctor is reporting amazing success treating cancer, arthritis, heart disease, and other untreatable illnesses. So you can be sure that when you get into this promotion, the lead will start to lay out this proposition that most major diseases that we worry about now will soon become extinct, and not for the reasons that you might have heard or that you might think that they might become extinct. So often a proclamation lead or a declaration lead is going to be connected to some kind of implied promise. So we saw the implied promise in that last one as the idea that we were going to be freed in a simpler way than we might have imagined from the future of diseases that we currently plague us now. Here's one that's an investment promotion that implies that you might have something shocking come down. Here's a warning about what's going to happen, and then here are 2 simple investments that can protect you. So it has a promise that's connected to that big declaration. So that's often the next part of what you would do in a big declaration lead. You have to startle somebody, but then you connect it with something that's some kind of promise. That's still not, though, everything that you need to do. Once you make that promise, you're going to have to prove, once you make that big claim, you're going to have to prove that that big thing that you've just declared could happen, that big statement that you just made, has validity. So just like in the other leads that we saw, you're immediately going to have to start showing why you would dare to make such a bold statement. You're going to have to tie it back down to earth so that people can understand this is a real thing with real importance. And doing that with details and proof and things like that, that's often what the lead part underneath the headline is going to do on a declaration lead. It's going to start showing you the detailed reasons that you would make such a big statement about what's about to happen. So this, one thing to note is, again, we're down at the indirect level of that spectrum. At this time, you're going to try not to talk about the product. You're not going to be talking about the offers. You're not going to be talking about who you are and those things, except where it might help maintain your credibility for making such a big claim. Maybe you have experience that lets you be that person who can look forward into the future and see what's coming down the pike. That doesn't mean you can't ever do that, where you mention the product or the offer. But most of the time, you are going to try to hold back on that so that you can do the work of letting them believe this bold claim that you just put forward. You just want to focus on that and wait to get to the product later. Once you do get to that point, when you need to make the transition to the product, the big, bold proclamation needs to come from somebody, and usually you get to that point where you need to say who you are and why you get to say this, and you lay out your expertise. That's often a good point where you can start making a transition to the product. That might be hinting that you have something available and not naming it yet, or it might be naming it that early. But usually in a declaration lead, you're pushing down the actual naming of what your solution is, and possibly the offer, you're pushing that down till later. So what can you do to get a very big, bold proclamation lead? If you need to do this, if you need to go out there and be able to say something that's going to be so big and strike your audience, often the way you're going to find it is just by digging into the subject matter and digging into the audience and where they are and what's going on in the news context. You know, these are so tied to the news that you want to find out, is there some kind of important piece of news or something like that that's going to have an impact, that's going to be different from what people expect. I often think about this like if you're a science fiction fan, or if you like even science fiction movies, when you go and you look at a science fiction story, science fiction stories offer these visions of the future, of things to come. And you find when you go back and you look at old science fiction stuff, that often the things that they talk about these amazing things that are going to happen in the future, are things that come about. Now, why is that? Why would somebody who's writing fiction be able to come up with these ideas that later become real? Things like the internet and things like that were featured in movies back in the 50s and 60s. Not called that, but very similar to what we have today. And iPhones and walkie-talkies and things like that were showing up in Star Trek type communicators where you could go and send somebody a message immediately who was far away. The reason that they're able to do that is because in order to do that writing, those writers sit down and they dig into what's happening, and then they extrapolate out from what's happening what could be next. So they're trying to figure that out. They're actually doing that work of trying to predict a future that could be possible. And they do that because that future that's possible and amazing is more believable when it's rooted in something that I'm already experiencing. The same thing happens in these kinds of leads. So you make this big, bold claim, and then your proof comes out, and the proof is often rooted in things that you know that are true, because it's our inclination to look at something and say, well, if this happens, that might happen, and that might happen, and it goes and plays out like that. So that's a lot of how that is built. So just in that proving process of a big, bold prediction type lead or a declaration type lead, you often end up doing that stuff, but you need to do deep research. You need to understand the context in which you're selling that into. So if you were going to try to do this yourself, and you're trying to figure out, you have an audience that you feel is on this unaware kind of spectrum, or maybe what you're trying to do is you're trying to reach an audience that you've never reached before, and you've got to reach a little bit further. What is the implication of the thing that you're selling? How is it going to change things? Or why is there going to be a greater need for this in the future? Or what is there in the news that's some kind of catalyst that's going to change what's going on? And you look at that and you figure out, how could I say something that's going to make everybody turn their heads and pay attention? What would that statement be? Look for some kind of amazing facts that you could root that in and to bring it back home. So you could say, I know that claim sounds incredibly bold. How could it be possible, for instance, that all the 20th century diseases are going to disappear now so early into the 21st century? How could that possibly be proved? And you look for the facts that you could tie that to. And try to figure that out. What would you do if you have a product? Make maybe a list of 5 or 10 big, bold claims that you would do. So in session 8, we're going to move to what is the last of the 6 lead types. And that's a very interesting one that can be applied really across the spectrum, but it works very well at this very outer edge of the indirect spectrum, which is why we place it there. For reasons that I'll explain when we get there, we'll talk about how to set it up and when you might use it, and how to find the stories that could be very effective in these story leads. So thank you very much, and we'll see you in session 8.